The doctors had a problem. Not a medical problem, exactly. A conceptual one. The kind of problem that arises when the evidence in front of you does not fit the framework you have been trained to apply to it, and the framework is too well established to simply discard, and the evidence is too consistent to ignore. Jim Brown played 9 seasons of professional football in the National Football League. He carried the ball 359 times. He was hit, on each of those carries, by men whose professional purpose was to bring him down as hard and as completely as possible. Men who weighed between 200 and 260 pounds and who had been specifically trained in the techniques of delivering maximum force to a ball carrier's body. He was hit by linebackers and defensive ends and safeties and cornerbacks, and, on the plays that broke down in ways that defenses hope for, by multiple defenders simultaneously. In 9 seasons and 359 carries, he missed exactly 0 games due to injury. Not a reduced role. Not a series of games where he played through something that limited what he could do. 0 games. The man who carried the ball more than any player in the history of the position at that point, who absorbed more contact per season than almost any player at any position, who was specifically targeted by defensive coordinators who understood that the most effective way to stop Jim Brown was to make each carry more physically costly than the last. That man played every game. When the doctors and trainers who worked with him during his career were asked about this, their answers had a quality that is unusual in medical professionals. They were honest about what they did not understand. They could point to certain things. His conditioning was extraordinary. The work he put into his body outside of football, the discipline of preparation that kept his muscles and joints in a state of readiness that most players did not maintain at his level. His technique was exceptional. The way he fell, the way he absorbed contact, the way his body managed force rather than simply receiving it. But these explanations, as accurate as they were, did not fully account for the outcome. Other players with excellent conditioning got hurt. Other players with good technique got hurt. The NFL is a league that produces injuries at a rate that the most careful preparation can reduce but cannot eliminate, because the game is played by human bodies against other human bodies at speeds, and with forces that exceed what the body was designed to sustain indefinitely. Jim Brown's body sustained it. For 9 seasons. Without missing a game. When someone finally asked him directly, not a doctor, not a trainer, but a reporter who had covered him long enough to understand that the direct question was the only question worth asking, Jim Brown's answer was not what anyone expected. He said, "I always got up slow." James Nathaniel Brown understood his body the way a craftsman understands a tool. Not just what it could do, but what it cost to do it, what it needed to keep doing it, what the difference was between using it and using it up. This understanding did not come from a trainer's manual or a conditioning program or any of the formal frameworks that professional sports organizations deploy to keep their assets functional. It came from attention, from years of paying careful attention to what his body told him and making decisions based on what he heard. He had been an athlete since before the word had the professional meaning it later acquired for him. On St. Simon's Island, on the fields of Manhasset, in the gyms and on the tracks and lacrosse fields of Syracuse, he had been asking his body to perform at levels that exceeded what the surrounding competition required. And he had been listening to the responses. He had been learning, through direct and repeated experience, what the body could give and what it needed in return. By the time he arrived in Cleveland in 1957, he had been conducting this education for the better part of 20 years. He knew things about his own physical capacity that the Browns' medical staff did not know and could not have known from the outside, because the information was internal, proprioceptive, experiential, the kind of knowledge that lives in the body rather than in any document that can be handed from one person to another. One of the things he knew was this: the moment after a hit is not wasted time. It is information. When Jim Brown went down, when a linebacker or a safety or a defensive end delivered the kind of contact that sent him to the ground. What happened in the seconds between the whistle and the moment he stood up was not recovery, it was assessment. He was running a diagnostic on the body that had just absorbed the force, cataloging what he found, making the determinations that would inform how he moved for the rest of the game. Where the impact had landed, what it had cost, what needed to be protected on the next carry, and what was fine. This is not something that most players do consciously. Most players get up as fast as they can because getting up fast communicates something to the defense. That the hit did not accomplish what it was designed to accomplish, that the carrier is not diminished, that the next carry is coming from the same source the last one came from. Getting up fast is a performance of resilience. It is also, when done reflexively and without assessment, a way of returning to action without knowing the full state of the instrument you are returning to action with. Jim Brown got up slow, deliberately slow, with the unhurried economy of a man who had decided, somewhere early in his career and held to it every time he went down for 9 years, that the assessment mattered more than the performance. That knowing what the hit had cost was more important than showing the defense that the hit had cost nothing. The defense misread this consistently. Defenders who hit Jim Brown hard and watched him rise slowly concluded, naturally enough, that the accumulation was working, that the physical toll of the game was building toward the point where Jim Brown would be less than Jim Brown, and that their job was to keep accelerating that accumulation. They hit him again. They hit him harder. They went for the same spots, the same joints, the same areas where the previous contact had landed, because that was where the damage was presumably building. What they did not understand was that Jim Brown had already noted those spots, had already made the adjustments, had already shifted his technique, his approach to the next carry, his positioning in the hit, subtly, invisibly, in ways that the defense could not detect because the adjustments were internal, to protect what the previous contact had identified as needing protection. He was, in this sense, using his own injuries as information, not ignoring them, not playing through them in the heroic, damage-accumulating way that football culture sometimes celebrates. Using them. Every hit told him something about what the defense was targeting and what his body needed in response, and he used that information the way he used everything. Precisely, practically, with the complete attention of a man who understood that the resource he was managing was finite and that managing it well was the difference between 9 seasons and 4. The NFL in the late 1950s and throughout the 1960s was not an organization that thought deeply about player health. This is not a criticism specific to that era's league. It is a description of how the relationship between professional football and the bodies that played it was understood at the time. Players were expected to play through pain. Playing through pain was framed as a virtue, a demonstration of the toughness that the game required and rewarded. The player who asked to come out of a game because something hurt was a player who was failing a fundamental test of what the game demanded. Jim Brown played in this culture. He absorbed its expectations and he met them. He never asked to come out of a game, never used an injury as a reason to reduce his availability, never gave the coaching staff or the organization any indication that his body was something less than fully functional. He met the culture's demand for availability completely. But he met it on his own terms and by his own method, which was different from the method the culture implicitly endorsed. The culture endorsed playing through pain by ignoring it, by refusing to acknowledge it, by treating the body's signals as obstacles to be overcome rather than information to be processed. Jim Brown played through pain by listening to it, by taking it seriously, by making it useful. This distinction sounds small. It produced, over 9 seasons, an outcome that the doctors who tried to explain it could not fully account for with the frameworks they had available. There was a trainer who worked with the Cleveland Browns through most of Jim Brown's career. He had been in professional football long enough to have a baseline understanding of what normal looked like. The normal accumulation of wear, the normal progression of small injuries into larger ones, the normal attrition of a body that played professional football over a sustained period of time. He knew what to expect when he examined a running back who had played 5 seasons, or 7, or 9. Jim Brown did not produce the examination results he expected. The joints were in better condition than the mileage suggested. The soft tissue damage that accumulated in most players at comparable usage rates was present, but not at the levels the mileage predicted. The things that should have been worse were not worse, or were worse in ways that were less functionally limiting than the same damage in other players. He asked Jim Brown about this once. Not in a clinical context, not in the formal examination that preceded a game or followed a particularly hard hit, but in the informal way that people who work closely together sometimes ask the questions they have been carrying for a long time. He asked, "How are you doing this?" Jim Brown thought about the question for a moment. The trainer was not asking about the conditioning, which was visible and documentable, and could be pointed to as a partial explanation. He was asking about the rest, the part that the conditioning did not fully account for. Jim Brown said, "I never fight the hit." The trainer wrote this down. He thought about it for the rest of the season, and into the next one, watching Jim Brown take contact and go down and rise slowly and go to the huddle and take contact again, and the more he watched with the specific attention of someone who has been given a key and is trying to understand the lock it opens, the more he understood what he was looking at. Jim Brown did not tense against impact. He did not brace in the way that most players brace, the full body stiffening that is a natural response to anticipated force, and that, while psychologically satisfying, concentrates force at the points of greatest tension rather than distributing it through the body. He received contact in a state of controlled relaxation. Not limp, not passive, but organized in a way that allowed force to move through rather than accumulate at a specific point. This is a description of a physical skill that is easier to describe than to execute. Most players cannot do it. The instinct to tense against a hit is powerful and deeply natural, rooted in the same protective reflexes that the body uses when it anticipates pain in any context. Overriding that instinct, not by suppressing it, but by replacing it with something more sophisticated, requires years of practice and a quality of body awareness that the game does not formally teach. Jim Brown had taught it to himself. Through the years on St. Simon's Island, and the fields of Manhasset, and the courts and tracks of Syracuse, through the process of paying attention to what his body told him and adjusting his responses based on what he heard, he had developed a relationship with impact that was different from the relationship most players had. He had learned to use the hit rather than simply absorbing it. 2. The question of what kept Jim Brown healthy is, in the end, a question with multiple answers that do not fully resolve into a single explanation. The conditioning was real. The technique was real. The body awareness was real. The habit of assessment, the slow rise, the diagnostic pause, the information gathering that happened in the space between going down and standing up, was real and was consequential. But there is something underneath all of these specific answers that they are each pointing toward. Something about the relationship between attention and endurance. Between taking something seriously and being able to sustain it. Between treating the instrument you are playing as something worth understanding rather than something to be driven until it stops. Jim Brown treated his body the way he treated everything else in his life. With the complete, practical, unsentimental attention of a man who understood that the things worth having required the work of understanding them. Not the work of grinding through them. The work of understanding them. The work of paying attention to what they were telling you and making decisions based on what you heard. He played 9 seasons and carried the ball 359 times and missed 0 games. He retired at 30, while still the best player in the league, with a body that was in better condition than the mileage should have allowed. He retired not because the body gave out, but because he decided to. Because the life was his, and he had other things to do with it, and the body he had managed so carefully for 9 years was going to be needed for those things too. The doctors who tried to explain the 9 seasons could not fully explain them. The trainer who wrote down Jim Brown's answer kept the note for the rest of his career. I never fight the hit. 4 words. The kind of answer that sounds simple until you try to do it, and then reveals itself as something that most people cannot do at all. Not because the instruction is unclear, but because the execution requires a quality of attention and a depth of body, understanding that cannot be acquired quickly or described completely, or transferred from one person to another through any medium, except years of paying your body is telling you, and what your body is. Discipline on what you hear. Jim Brown had that quality. He had built it over a lifetime of asking his body to perform at levels that the game had not previously seen and listening carefully to what the performance cost and adjusting accordingly. The result was 9 seasons. The result was 359 carries. The result was 0 games missed and a body that retired in better condition than the mathematics of the position suggested was possible. The result was Jim Brown walking off a football field at 30 years old, unhurried, with somewhere else to be, carrying in the body he had managed so carefully for so long everything he would need for whatever came next. The doctors never fully explained it. The trainer kept the note. 2. There is a particular kind of athlete who understands, earlier than most, that the body is not a machine to be operated, but a system to be understood. The distinction sounds philosophical until you watch what it produces over time. The difference between the player who is brilliant at 24 and diminished at 29, and the player who is still performing at the outer edge of his capacity at 30, because he has spent the previous 12 years learning the system rather than simply running it. Jim Brown was the second kind. He had been the second kind before he knew there was a distinction to be made, before the language for it existed in any framework he had encountered. He had been the second kind because the alternative, treating the body as a resource to be spent rather than a system to be managed, had never made sense to him on the level where sense is actually made, which is the level of direct experience rather than received wisdom. The received wisdom of football said play through it. The received wisdom said the hit that takes you out of a game is the hit you let take you out of a game, and the difference between a player who stays on the field and one who doesn't is not physical, but psychological. The received wisdom had a long tradition and a lot of authority behind it, and was, in the specific application of it that most players made, a good way to accumulate damage faster than the body could repair it. Jim Brown heard the received wisdom and made his own determination about how much of it was applicable to his specific situation. The parts that were true, that mental toughness was real, that the willingness to play in discomfort was a genuine athletic attribute, he kept. The parts that were not true, that paying attention to what your body was telling you was weakness, that the assessment of damage was the same thing as giving in to it, he discarded. This is a harder thing to do than it sounds. The culture of professional football in the 1960s was not a culture that made space for the kind of nuanced relationship with physical experience that Jim Brown was developing. It was a culture of extremes. You played or you didn't, you were tough or you weren't, you pushed through the pain or you let the team down. The middle ground, where honest assessment lived, was not a comfortable place to occupy. Jim Brown occupied it anyway, not by announcing it, not by making it a point of contention with coaches or trainers or the cultural expectations of the league, but by practicing it quietly and consistently on every carry and in every recovery room and in every off-season training session where he was the only one who knew exactly what the work was doing to the body doing it. 2. The off-seasons were where the real management happened. Most players in the NFL of the 1960s treated the off-season as a period of partial recovery. Some rest, some maintenance, a gradual return to activity as training camp approached. The season had used the body hard, and the off-season was the time to let it come back to something closer to its baseline before the next season began the process again. Jim Brown's off-seasons were different in a way that the people who trained alongside him noticed and sometimes found difficult to reconcile with the conventional understanding of how elite athletes maintained their conditioning. He did not simply train hard. Everyone trained hard, or said they did. He trained with a specificity that suggested he understood exactly what the previous season had cost and exactly what the next season would require, and was building the bridge between those two things with the precision of a man who had done the accounting. The joints that had taken the most contact got the most attention. The muscles that had compensated for small imbalances during the season, the compensations that become visible only when you pay close enough attention to the body's patterns over time, were addressed before they became problems. The things that most players accumulated over a career, the layers of minor damage that built on each other until they became major damage, Jim Brown managed actively rather than reactively, treating small things when they were small rather than waiting for them to become large. He also rested. This is worth noting because it was not the norm. The athletic culture of the era tended toward the valorization of continuous work. The player who never stopped, who was always in the gym or on the field, who demonstrated commitment through volume of effort. Jim Brown understood rest as part of the work, not as its absence, as an active component of the preparation that made the performance possible. He had learned this the way he learned everything that mattered about his body, through direct experience, through paying attention to what happened when he rested adequately versus when he did not, through the evidence that accumulated over years of treating the question with the seriousness it deserved. The result, by the time he reached his final seasons, was a body that had been managed well enough over a long enough period that its condition exceeded what the usage suggested. The joints were not the joints of a man who had carried the ball more than 2,000 times. The soft tissue was not the soft tissue of a man who had absorbed that volume of professional contact. The body was, in a meaningful sense, younger than the career. 2. Jim Brown retired at 30. He walked away from the game while the body was still capable of playing it at the highest level, while the management that had preserved it through 9 seasons had left it with enough remaining capacity that several more seasons were plausible. He retired not because the body had given out, but because he had decided to. Because the other things he wanted to do with his life required the same body, and the body was still in the condition to do them. This is perhaps the final and most complete expression of the approach that had kept him healthy through 9 seasons. He did not use the body until it stopped. He used it until he had done what he came to do with it, and then he stopped, not because he had to, but because he understood the difference between using a resource and depleting it, and he had always been more interested in the former than the latter. The doctors who examined him during his career and who looked at the records afterward, the game logs and the injury reports and the absence of injury reports, were looking at the evidence of this understanding without always being able to name what they were looking at. They were looking at what 9 seasons of professional football looked like when the body doing it was managed the way Jim Brown managed his. It looked like 0 games missed. It looked like 359 carries and a retirement at 30 with somewhere else to be. It looked like an answer so simple that the people who heard it had to think about it for a long time before they understood what it actually contained. I never fight the hit. The answer was always the same. The doctors never fully explained it. The trainer kept the note. He never fought the hit. He listened to it. He used it. And then he got up, slowly, deliberately, with the complete composure of a man who had already processed what had just happened and was already thinking about what came next. He always got up,